ever so often arrives a titan of skill, supreme and sublime, whose life and works will, with achievement itself rhyme, such as may have set the stage, mayhaps even defined an age. But our man, if you will, was not of an age that for all time.
Welcome to this series exploring innovation, progress and achievement using a technocentric paradigm by Ash Stuart.
You may want to also read Ash's original Substack article for the best experience, including footnotes and other details.
Episode 35D, The Art of Reinvention, Remaking Language, Literature, Life Itself, Elevating Word, Thought and Deed, soundly, smoothly, spectacularly. We've already seen in this mini-series a trilogy tracing the development of the English language, such as in Episode 35A, becoming slimmer, stronger and sleeker, having shed the unnecessary baggage of word endings. Then in Episode 35B, where Chaucer gave respectability to that language. And finally in Episode 35C, where despite the hit-and-miss development of spelling, English found a foothold and some unexpected advantages. We will now meet English's greatest and smoothest operator, its most effective and eloquent elevator, its most remarkable and rakish reinventor. Yes, we will. Enter William Shakespeare.
How many of the greatest people hadn't written or commented about Old Bill? There is perhaps more said about him than almost anyone else in the field of intellectual achievement or literature. So what small fry am I to even try? But do give me chance.
In rudimentary health.
I have often mentioned a key epistemological principle of mine, that to understand any concept or phenomenon properly, one has to understand what came before it and what is around it, as I call it, the diachronic and the paratopic. See Episode 08. So let's explore Shakespeare as well from such a first principles angle. The three prequels to this, having served as the what came before, let's now get some context of the world Shakespeare came into. We're now roughly in mid to late 1500s England. It's what will be known to history as the Elizabethan era, Queen Elizabeth I being, as it would turn out, the last of the Tudor monarchs. With roughly a century past since Caxton's press, the English language has acquired a certain degree of stability in the written medium. But some of the problems that plagued Chaucer still remain. In fact, including the literal plague which revisits and will have a contingent transformatory effect on young Bill. We saw how Geoffrey Chaucer, in the late 1400s, had to struggle with the language not having a proper standard, but also to contend with the power and prevalence of French and Latin. So even 100 years later, this situation somewhat lingers, despite Chaucer's own monumental achievements in this regard, as I've documented. The difference, though, is, thanks to Chaucer, the language had been demonstrated as capable of taking on advanced topics. But despite the structural readiness for innovation, it was hampered by a lingering reputation for linguistic rudeness. It was seen as an unlettered medium and thus excluded from the elite registers of education, scholarship, and international diplomacy, where Latin still reigned supreme.
Verses contra verses.
there were attempts to address the situation. Notably, one Richard Mulcaster in the 1580s argued forcefully that English was indeed capable of expressing ideas as effectively as any other. He provided the philosophical and aspirational defense of English. But it was still just that, aspirational. There was this ongoing debate in the question of how to write English, the so-called inkhorn controversy, whether to use simple, plain, and earthy Anglo-Saxon words, or to utilize ornate, supercilious, magniloquent, Latin-derived vocabulary, QED. Poets such as John Lyly, who wrote in an ornate style matching classical works, embodied this. Perhaps the most notable of these pioneers, and one perhaps better known than these just-named figures, was Christopher Marlowe. To serve as a respectable literary vehicle, every language has to have effective means of expression and elocution. Marlowe revived the iambic pentameter championed by Chaucer and refined it further, perfecting its use in an unrhymed form, what's called the blank verse. As I've discussed in Chaucer's episode, this meter both brilliantly captures the rhythm of the English language, but also mimics the heartbeat, da-dum, 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 making for really evocative, even mesmerizing expression. I'll give you an example of this, I promise. And by opting for the unrhymed, Marlowe freed it from a critical constraint. While rhyme may be pleasing to the ear, it restricts the breadth of your expression to the range of rhyming words available. But in the end, Marlowe's style was too grandiose and somewhat far removed to be appealing to most people. It is to this world, then, from Stratford-upon-Avon, one fine day, after a 4-day walk into London, arrives a young William Shakespeare, seemingly from nowhere.
Early stages to center stage.
But Shakespeare didn't come out of nowhere, but it was in some sense a steep climb even before that long walk. John Shakespeare, Bill's father, started off as a glover in Stratford-upon-Avon and rose up the ranks to eventually become mayor. This means, fortunately for us, he was able to give William, the first of 8 children to survive, a decent schooling. This was the Tudor Grammar School, which included a rigorous study around the classical. Trivium, which we briefly saw in episode 36. The trivium comprised grammar, logic, and rhetoric, all studied in Latin medium. You had to speak Latin not only in class, but also in the playground. That was just the, modus operandi and ludendi. An important component here was rhetoric, the art and science of using persuasive language to make a decisive impact in your communication. And an important figure in this was Cicero, that master of Latin rhetoric. I've discussed both Cicero, the OG reinventor, and the importance of rhetoric, his lasting legacy, in detail in episode 30b. Shakespeare was quick to be recognized within the drama circles in London, the inchoate industry, small but growing, which in the spirit of the Renaissance and humanist thought was a field distinct from the older world of focus on the religious, something I treated in some detail in episode 34, where we met Petrarch. Starting small, he went on to become the giant we know him to be today. He did achieve a huge part of that fame within his lifetime, although his reputation grew much more in later centuries, especially the 1800s. So yes, the rest is history. A history, as I said, written and revised by so many people in the last 4+ centuries. Let's now examine his achievements and legacy, however, from our unique technocentric view of studying innovation. What made him different? Why not someone else?
Wild and free.
From our perspective, Shakespeare is much misunderstood. Apart from the idea of lone genius, a notion which I've sought to debunk previously, such as in episode 45 in reference to Brunelleschi, there is that widely held myth that Shakespeare invented 1,700 words. In fact, reality is a lot more nuanced than that, as it always is, and as he could so well demonstrate in his works. The Elizabethan era was sort of the Wild West for the English language. As noted earlier, it had emerged as a capable medium, but not many folk were using it yet, or it was too early days to the point that not many people knew how to best wield its capabilities. Anyone lived through such a phase in their lives. In practical terms, there was no standardization, no established set of rules on how to use the English language. And Shakespeare was well poised to step in and sort things out. The time was just right.
Fine coins, finer fines.
Rather than saying Shakespeare invented 1,700 words, latest computer-aided research facilitated by the incorporation of other works during and even prior to his writing has demonstrated that many of the words the dictionaries conventionally, and you might say somewhat zealously, attributed to him, in fact, did exist, bringing down his contribution by way of first-time coinage and use to about a third. Mind you, that's not to throw out recognition of the vast vocabulary the bard possessed. But Shakespeare's contribution can be appreciated by looking at the original meaning of the word inventio. That word in classical Latin rather referred to finding, discovery, uncovering, brainstorming, with Cicero's de inventione being the go-to manual for rhetoric. What Shakespeare did was he synthesized existing elements of expression, utilized the aforementioned already demonstrated capabilities of the English language. Yes, he did also come up with genuinely original elements, but he fundamentally integrated all these in a way nobody had ever done.
Englishing a new flex.
He did not invent English's flexibility, he showcased it. He took it from a lurking potential to a respectable and repeatable standard. The classic example of this is his prolific verbing of nouns, or generally repurposing a word, nouning of verbs, adjectiving them. You get the idea. I've given examples of this in episode 35A, such as his famous Out Herod. Here's a few more. Wolves would jaw me, he childed, as I fathered, a better where to find. These may seem odd to us, which is because they're not commonly in use examples, but there are tons cases where we've made such changes to the extent that we don't realize it. Inching towards, heading out, table the motion, hand it over, necking, even screwed. And here's my favorite. When British politician Michael Foot was set to lead a nuclear disarmament committee, a newspaper headline read, "Foot, Heads, Arms, Body." But it was not just playing with word forms. The education in rhetoric involved internalizing more than 200 rhetorical devices. Shakespeare demonstrated unparalleled mastery in deploying these devices in his works, creating an evocative impact pretty much unparalleled. One supreme example of this is soliloquy, that famous phrase in Hamlet we all instinctively blurt out at any sudden mention of Shakespeare. The extended monologue where the speaker contemplates his own existence and morbidity. Shakespeare elevated this device into a mechanism of intellectual disputation and psychological relevation. Lest you think that Hamlet monologue was his be-all and be-not-all, there's a lot more, lot more. but I won't get into all the 200 devices here, for that would just be not to be.
Baking it all in.
We saw in the Chaucer episode, briefly repeated in the last one, how English is essentially not a single language. It's a lasagna of basic Anglo-Saxon, with a layer of Norse, then of Norman French, later French, Latin, Greek. And I mentioned above this tension in the form of the inkhorn controversy. Shakespeare settled this matter by deploying the full range of vocabulary options available, exploiting this to, for instance, indicate nuances of social status or demonstrate a speaker's emotional state. Prior to Shakespeare, one was wont to resort to French or Latin for certain registers or topics. After Shakespeare, one could confidently expound anything in English. You can see how I've weaponized this capability by observing my word choices in the latter part of episode 25b. As part of this, Shakespeare perfected full character development, multi-register expression, and the expansion of topic range to the entire gamut of intellectual discourse. Thus, Shakespeare led the way to the canonization of the English language. He set a standard of speech to emulate, to compare one's own against, to seek to surpass. To out-Shakespeare Shakespeare, I hear you say? The King James Bible, also a product of roughly the same time, commissioned by Queen Elizabeth I's Stuart successor, King of Scotland and England, being one of the most widely read books over centuries in the English language, has had, like it or not, a lasting influence on our speech. And the writings of a glove-maker's son from a small town stands right up there next to the King James Bible as one of the great yardsticks of the English language. You may not speak Bible English, you may not speak the Queen's English, but in some way, we all speak Shakespeare's English. One may be tempted to paraphrase something that was said in reference to the great philosopher Bertrand Russell. There is no literature that is post-Shakespeare, but only propter Shakespeare. Please allow me to end this now by, in my own words, paying homage to the Bard of Avon. Well, I say in my own words, but this is in fact a rewording of one of his most famous pieces, which I've sought to repurpose and render as a culmination of these 4 articles of mine here.
This sublime home of words, this sceptred word, this voice of majesty, this song of wit, this our Carmen demi-paradox, this gorgeous gift Calliope bestowed, extending human bounds of eloquence, this happy means of thought, this lean machine, this precious gem set in a global sea which serves to bind, to link humanity, or as a force connective to a house towards a kinship common for all lands, this blessed sound, this tongue, this speech, this English.